to mind, from Bat Conservation International to the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. I just started as a volunteer for the Arizona Elk Society. But I'm a strong believer that individuals do not own wildlife. And a lot of people think that the Pilgrims came to this country just seeking religious freedom. But in fact, one of the things that they were seeking was the freedom to hunt and fish and provide for their own families so that they would not commit a capital offense by killing one of the king's deer. Based on that, I've been a strong believer all my life in the importance of conservation and in the role that both state and federal governments play in managing wildlife. I think it's very critical for the future of wildlife, for the future of the resource. And frankly, I want my grandchildren, I have 6 now, I want them to have the same opportunities that I had growing up, which is one of the reasons that I want to stay involved. My military experience is on the resume, and I can go into any details if you'd like, but I'd rather not spend my time talking about that today. Hobbies are anything outdoors. We ride our horses, mountain biking, hunting, fishing, hiking, and doing things to stay fit to enable me to do all of those. I've lived all over the state, from cells on the Tohono O'odham Reservation to parks now, and now that I'm home, I'm excited to see more of it. As far as goals, I have, if selected, I have 3 overarching goals, and obviously I can go into these in a lot more detail. But first and foremost is to successfully serve both the people and the wildlife of Arizona. Second is to generate revenue. And this is one of my concerns that just looking at the agency, I think that it's one of our greatest points of vulnerability for the future. And then lastly is to do everything I can to help make the Arizona Game and Fish Department a great place to work where people can thrive. So thanks again for the opportunity to meet with you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Buchanan. I think we're going to start off the first round of questions with Phil.
Thank you, General. Appreciate you being here today. Okay, Jeff, thank you for being here today. You've earned the title, General, so thank you. Thank you for your service. You started to touch on it a little bit in your opening statement, but this will be my first question. Wildlife conservation is not paid for with general tax dollars. How familiar are you with the department and the commission's efforts to generate discretionary revenue to keep up with the increases in wildlife management costs? And can you name any of the efforts that are currently being used?
Yeah, so I talked as well about the fact that the Pilgrims came to this country and people don't own wildlife. And when you look at the North American conservation model and Arizona's adoption of that and their version of it, which includes 7 core values, one of those is that funding comes from the creation of revenue dominantly from hunters, anglers, boaters, and shooters. So a lot of that comes from, we get revenue from the really the creation of the Pittman-Robertson Act. So there's a tax on the sale of firearms, ammunition, fishing equipment, etc. And then all states are provided some revenue from that. This state in particular does not receive tax dollars from its citizens. It's funded entirely by things like Pittman-Robertson Acts, from monies coming from the federal government, plus generation of revenue for a number of different initiatives. And some of those include, for example, the big game raffle. So I know that the state had a significant amount of money generated from the big game raffle, provides 10 hunters each year with an opportunity to shoot one of the Big Ten over a year-long season, and that's been a key. Obviously, the sale of licenses, and I would like to talk a little bit about that. I just received my lifetime hunting and fishing combo. Thank you very much for being a 100% disabled veteran. Even though I look pretty normal, I've got a lot of broken pieces parts. But other states, this is something I think that we ought to think about. Other states, for example, Idaho, I like to hunt in Idaho. And one of the reasons is because they give disabled veterans a break on non-resident fees. Now, still have to buy a non-resident license, but it's roughly the same as resident fees. So Idaho is very attractive to pull in money. So that's an example. I want to commend the commission and the department on wildlife use. That helped me stay in touch with what was going on, but I think it's through these opportunities and outreach that I think we can maintain contact with all of the public, and in particular, young people. This is my concern. I know that as you look at the demographics, there's fewer and fewer young people hunting and fishing, and so this for us, I think, is an opportunity to get them much more involved and in fact raise revenues.
Mr. Chairman? Yes. Thank you very much for being present. Could you give us a summary of how you feel about this particular issue, which is that the state, through the commission and the department, has management responsibility for wildlife, but the federal government also has its position in the management of species, especially if they are identified as endangered, and that often leads to some interface, significant levels of interface between the state and the federal government. What is your view of that situation?
Sure. So in some places, I think it's very appropriate for the federal government to be involved. In some cases, I think not. So this again goes back to this idea about wildlife being part of a public trust and who's responsible for management of the resource. So our nation is a republic. Okay, we are not a dictatorship. And if you look at the power of the states, and you go back to our Constitution, states have some very important responsibilities. And I dealt with this from the federal military side a lot when dealing, supporting state governors in usually pretty bad situations. But the governor is a sovereign entity responsible for what goes on in that state. So I said I think it's appropriate for the federal government to be involved in management of some things, but not all. Particular when we're talking about migratory species, and in particular game birds. Or birds that go across state boundaries. Much as the FBI would have jurisdiction for crimes committed and going across state boundaries, when you have significant migration of wildlife, I think it's important for the federal government to be involved. So we're really talking waterfowl, doves, things like this. But sir, I think I read a letter recently that you signed about what was going on with mule deer in the Arizona Strip up on the Kaibab Plateau. And there was, I think, a veiled attempt by the federal government to classify mule deer as migratory because the herd was moving back and forth between Arizona and Utah, and then use that as a subterfuge to create a new national monument and create federal jurisdiction over something that they had no business being involved in. So I think it really depends on what species are we talking about and what's the significance of it. Jaguar. So we have I'm originally from Cochise County. We have jaguars occasionally in Cochise County, and they move back and forth between the international boundary and between Mexico and the United States. So I think there's a role there for both the federal government and the state government to be involved.
Thank you very much. I actually will follow up on that. I'm glad you brought up the jaguar. Do you have an understanding of yourself of the role of the federal government in creating critical habitat?
I do.
Like for the jaguar?
I do.
Could you
Sure.
elaborate a bit?
The jaguar's complicated. I just got involved in a bunch of things with respect to border security, stopping people to go back and forth. But when you stop people, you also have a tendency to stop large predators. I don't know if any of you have ever read The Spine of the Continent, but pretty interesting book about the role of the apex predator and why it's important to be able to move throughout its range. But I do believe there's a role for the federal government to create critical habitat. I think that I didn't really answer all of your question about endangered species, but I think that that comes about when we start talking about wolf populations. So if you look at what happened up in Wyoming, Idaho, Montana with respect to wolves, and initially being listed as part of the endangered species after reintroduction, eventually that was lifted and they have huntable populations. I think that there's a lot going on here with respect to the Mexican wolf, with both Arizona, New Mexico, the country of Mexico, and the federal government, and a lot of decisions to be made in the future about what goes on with our wolf population. Obviously reintroduced, looks like it's gaining steam. Will they be lifted someday off of the endangered species? Potentially. Will they be a huntable species? Potentially. I do think we need to listen to all people involved, including ranchers who have a concern about wolf populations. I will share with you personally, I have absolutely no problem with hunting of carnivores. I think it's an important management tool. Again, you can compare mountain lions in Arizona with California and what goes on there. I think it's really important. I personally won't shoot a carnivore because my dad beat it into me that you're going to eat everything that you kill. And I have shot exactly one coyote. He made me eat it, and I won't do that again. But I think it's important for all of us to have as a management tool.
Thank you very much.
Jeff, my question for you this morning, do you feel having an education and public relations program for the public so they understand who and how we manage wildlife is important?
I think it's absolutely critical. And this really gets to outreach. Let me give you an example. So I talked about funding and how sportsmen, anglers, and hunters dominantly fund this entire department. What's one of the greatest resources we have on the non-game side? Birding. Okay, we have thousands and thousands of birders that come to this state. But I think there's an untapped resource when it comes to supporting the state agency who manages a lot of those non-game species. And there's a big reason a lot of people go to Ramsey Canyon or again, Huachuca Canyon to see trogons, or Ramsey Canyon to see, I think, 14 different species of hummingbirds. But I'm not sure what advantage we are getting from that, even though this agency plays a critical role in helping to manage all those non-game species. So I think outreach, even to people who aren't sportsmen, is very, very important. And like I said, with respect to youth, it's important to bring them into the sport. Let me tell you just briefly about something that I've discovered with my kids. I would take them turkey hunting when they were young, and they enjoyed it, but none of the three ever really got into hunting until they started providing meat, having to provide meat for their own families. Now, two of my sons married ladies who formerly were vegetarians. I'm happy to say they're not now. One of them will only eat things that either I or her husband kills. She will not eat meat out of a grocery store, but has no problem eating wild meat. I think that our wildlife is the ultimate in terms of free-range organic food. And so when we look at young people, we have to figure out what's going to motivate them and how can we get them involved. In this case, it might be that. But I do think education and outreach are critical.
Thank you very much. Rich?
Good morning, General Jeff. First of all, let me thank you for your service, many years of service, and quite a distinguished record serving this country. You've covered a lot of ground this morning, but if you would, can you categorize what you think the two most important issues are that both the commission and the department will face in the next 5 years?
So I think I hit one, and I've talked about it at length, which I think is generational revenue. We have to find a way to continue to raise money. We can get into it later, I am apolitical, but one of my values, I believe, is I don't like big government. I don't like, especially on the federal side, I don't like lots of taxes. And I don't think I don't think imposition of a tax is the way to go forward. So we have to figure out how to generate revenue without taxing. And there's a lot of different options. And the department's actually doing a great job. I just think we need to put water and fertilizer on it so that it grows more and more. But I do believe generation of revenue is one of the biggest challenges. I'll tell you, I think that we have an issue with climate change. You know, and I've spent a lot of time on the military side. The last 3 years, I was dealing with North America. We've got an issue going on right now in the Arctic. Now, I know this is not Arizona, but it ought to force us to think about. There's things going on with respect to a changing climate that are going to impact a lot. I was fishing for a month in Alaska this summer, and the water temperature in Katchaback Bay where we were fishing was 58 degrees. It's never been that high. We broke 90 degrees a couple of times in Homer. We had one wildfire up there that was 160,000 acres and lasted 3 months. And these are the results of the changing climate. With respect to the Arctic, you got opening sea lanes, and because of opening sea lanes, it's going to increase maritime traffic, increases competition. I know this is not about national security. That's not what you're asking me about, but it affects all of us. So you got the Russians and the Chinese very much involved in the Arctic right now. I saw climate change impact what was going on the southwest border. Because you've got failing coffee crops in Guatemala, the people need to find a place to go, so they're coming north. I think a changing climate is going to continue to affect us for years and years. Now, you can argue about what are the causes of it, how much of it is man-made, how much of it is natural evolution. I don't know. I'm not a scientist with respect to those things, but it's something that we need to deal with, and it's going to affect our wildlife. And so, you know, the more we understand about it, the more we can better protect the resource. I think it's really important, though.
Thank you.
Good morning. Bear chase, along with the North American model for wildlife conservation, should be the two backbones of hunting in our nation and state. Tell me why this statement is accurate and your views of the two items, bear chase and the North American model.
So I already talked a little bit about the North American model. I've hit on several of them, and then I'll get to fair chase next. But 7 core principles in Arizona. The first one is really that the public owns wildlife. The second is that commerce is regulated. In other words, you know, we don't sell things. We don't sell wildlife. There's no market hunting, these kinds of things anymore. Third is that there should be opportunity for all. So it doesn't matter how much money you have or how much land you own. You don't actually own the wildlife, but everybody ought to have access to the resource. Fourth is that laws are created through a public process. Of course, the board plays a very important role in that. I heard you ask for the blue cards up front, but there's an opportunity for all people in the state to participate in the creation of our game laws. The next one is funding. We've talked about funding, but funding is dominantly provided by hunters, anglers, boaters, and shooters. Sixth is that wildlife's an international resource. So our work with Mexico, by the way, I've done a lot of work with the Mexican government, in particular the Mexican Army. They're great partners, regardless of what you might read in the press. They're actually pretty good, and we work very, very closely together on the military side. But wildlife's an international resource, and it goes across boundaries. We talked about jaguar, just as an example. Ocelot's another one. But we need to have an international understanding when it comes to dealing with wildlife. And then lastly, science is a foundation for our policy. We don't decide how many elk are we going to take off of 7 West by how many rocks there are in the parking lot and going kicking them around thinking about, well, we killed 140 bulls last year, what do you think about this year? We do it based on science. So what do we think the carrying capacity is? What are we going to lose through predation, winter, whatever? And then how much excess is left actually to where we can harvest that. So that's the North American model. The other part you asked about was fair chase. And again, as an archery hunter, I'm a big time believer in fair chase. You know, if it was just about harvesting wildlife, I mean, there are things out there these days, and I know from the military perspective, there are things you can use that almost guarantee a kill, whether it's smart weapons using drones to help with surveillance and all of this. I think all of that is absolutely inappropriate. I don't think it's fair for the wildlife. I don't think it's fair for our fellow sportsmen. I applaud this state in that you have not gone to the universal crossbow for archery season. As a bow hunter, I think that's the wrong thing, and some states have done it. Again, I have no problem if somebody's got a broken arm or shoulder or whatever and they can't use a bow and they can get a doctor's permission, go to a crossbow, and that's what this state allows. But a lot of states, including the one I just came from, Texas, you know, they allow crossbow for archery season, and to me a crossbow is just a short-range rifle.
Any follow-up, Pat?
No, I'm good on that.
Okay, let's go ahead and start the second round of questions. Phil?
Okay, you pretty much answered what was going to be my second question, but just off the top of my head, the Arizona Game and Fish Department is managed by a commission. It's a commission style of governing the department, so to speak. Have you had any experience working with a commission style department, and do you have a full understanding of just the role of a commissioner with the department?
With respect to state government, no, sir. I've dealt in a lot of leadership situations with national governments, international governments. I'll give an example. 2015 to 16, I was the deputy commander of U.S. Forces Afghanistan. And I was also the director of operations for what was then called Operation Resolute Support, which is a NATO mission. So we had 49 member nations. And so it was a unique organization, because if you want to motivate somebody to do something, you can't necessarily direct them to do it. You know, if you're from the country of Georgia, it might be interesting that the U.S. Army guy, wants you to do something, but what does your national leadership want you to do? That would be your first line of allegiance. So the big idea is unity of effort in a thing like that. Now I think that principle, unity of effort, applies or should apply to how the commission works. We need to work together for the betterment of the wildlife and the people of Arizona. So we need to be open to all. But all in all, that commission as a body, I hope with diverse viewpoints, but as a body can come together and provide purpose, direction, and motivation for the entire department, give them a direction to move for the betterment of wildlife and the people.
Thank you.
Sue?
Mr. Chairman, your answers are quite complete and expansive, and so I'm also having to alter my second question because you answered half of it. You mentioned that you're from Cochise County.
Yes, ma'am.
And that you are at Cochise is right on the border interface. Can you discuss what you see as appropriate elements of critical habitat and how those elements for the jaguar are present and how those interface with the needs of the United States to secure the border?
Right, so a lot of that last part of the question makes it really complex. But any species is going to need access to food, water, cover, shelter, these kinds of things. And so the critical habitat is habitat that provides a mix of all of that. You know, if you go to the northern side of Yavapai County and you see miles and miles and miles of juniper forest, that's actually you know, pretty similar throughout. But it's where you find, okay, where's there a creek coming through, or where's there a piece of open area so that you get that edge effect that gives different species opportunities to take advantage of all that they need with respect to cover, water, access to food. Now, jaguar as an apex predator, and I'm not an expert in this because I know most jaguar are actually in Mexico and South America. But with respect to our country, their dominant species for prey is probably white-tailed deer, I think. And one of the reasons is because, again, where they go in southeastern Arizona are the Sky Islands. So the mountains, the Chiricahuas, the Huachucas, the Santa Ritas, maybe to an extent the whetstones, although they may not be high enough. But that gives them access to a lot of different things. Everything from aspen fir at the top down to grasslands at the bottom, mesquite, transitioning to oak, juniper, etc., all the way up through ponderosa pine. So they get a lot of variation in cover and potentially prey species. Plus those Sky Islands have access to water, which the jaguar need. That's what makes, well, that's why we have trogons here. That's why we have so many different species of hummingbird. It's a very diverse environment. But through the years, jaguar have been in that area. Ocelots as well, by the way. I think that, you know, again, the issue is we need to control movement, again, from a national perspective of people across that border. There's lots of ways to do it, but we have to, at the same time, I think, provide for movement of wildlife, and in particular, jaguar back and forth across the border. Now, I think the optimum way to do that, frankly, is through better surveillance. Right now, the Border Patrol is stretched very, very thin across that section of border. We are doing some things on the military side with respect to fixed platforms, with respect to UAVs, but we need more of it so that we can do better surveillance. So that when somebody comes across the border, by the way, most of the people coming across the border are just migrants. But the really bad guys know that. And they use that to flood the Border Patrol. So they'll push migrants across in a large number in a certain area. So the Border Patrol has to shoot in towards that and then move their drugs or high-value targets across in a different area. They're very good at this. So we can anticipate that through better surveillance. And I don't necessarily mean man hours, but through the technology we have to allow us to better provide for that security and catch the bad guys. We can use what I used to use, there's a, what we in the military would call a J-lens, but it's a large balloon on the edge of Fort Huachuca that's up. It's really looking at airspace, but it can also look at movement on the ground. When winds blow high, you got to bring that thing down. And the bad guys know this. And of course, when the balloon comes down, they push their product across. Well, I think if we anticipate that, we can use it for what we in the military would call a baited ambush. Surge our assets in a certain area, bring the balloon down, and then catch guys. So it's through these kinds of more proactive border security things that I think that we can do a better job enforcing the border, but at the same time allowing for movement of critical wildlife species. Trogons I'm not worried about because they can fly back and forth.
Thank you very much. I make one more little comment. I'll personally invite you to our ranch, which is on the border, and I do mean that. You come look at the situation.
Yes,
Thank
ma'am.
you.
Jeff, my next question for you is, how do you see social issues impacting scientific wildlife management?
Wow. Well, I think I think that it shouldn't impact. Science should not be based on politics. And politics sometimes derives its interests and direction from social issues. But let me give you an example. I found when I was reviewing the commission's responsibilities, one of the things that I found interesting, I'm going to say interesting, was that the commission has a responsibility for establishing policies, regulations with respect to the taking of wildlife. Of course, all of that is like one would expect, except for there was one little sub-sentence there, except for determining the capacity of magazines for weapons. Now, again, I don't know the details of what that comes about, but there's an interest there. It's not really a social issue, but it's certainly a political issue. There's an interest there somewhere from a gun control or anti-gun control group that got involved with the commission's responsibilities that potentially ultimately affects management of wildlife. Now, it shouldn't affect the science of it, you know. But if you have there's a fundamental difference between a Ruger bolt action 30-06 and an M4 that has 30 rounds. Okay, now so there's a social issue or a issue that's become political about gun control, but it also affects what Mr. Madden asked about with respect to fair chase. You know, so to me, again, your question was about the science. It shouldn't affect, from my opinion, it shouldn't affect the science, but it will affect, as it should affect, how we do things.
Thank you. Rich?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jeff, you've covered a lot of ground, but to maybe be a little more specific, what do you think the commission and the department can do to convince the citizens of Arizona to allow the department to manage with science instead of the ballot box?
Well, I think you asked a question that got at this earlier, but I think education is the key. I believe fundamentally people are good. A lot of times they are confused. And it's because of what they have heard. Okay, I'll give you a quick example. I was buying a new set of bibs for when I was in Homer, Alaska, and I was in this sporting goods store, and I heard a young man who's probably 17 or 18 years old, and he was handling an AR-15, and the guy behind the counter just mentioned this takes a NATO 5.56 round. Okay, so it's a standard piece of NATO ammunition. And the young man, like I said, 17 or 18 years old, starts going off on how worthless NATO was, or is. And I couldn't help myself. I know I just should have shut up and not say anything, but I couldn't help myself. I had to say, listen, I was born in Germany in 1959. You know, I mean, my dad was in the army there. There's a reason that we never had a nuclear war. And it was because of NATO. You know, yes, the United States contributes more than any nation, but this guy had apparently just spent all his time listening to far right-wing radio. And his belief was that NATO was worthless. And like I said, 17 years old. To me, it was a shame. But it's lack of education. It's because people are fed certain things, and you know, I've dealt a lot with media, and you know, you can see an event happen, and if you want to get two completely different interpretations, go to MSNBC and go to Fox. But it's the same event. The problem is that some people will only consume a certain thing, and based on that, they don't have a broad range. They don't have a broader education, and so I think it's pretty dangerous. So I think that through education, especially to young people, you know, Aldo Leopold, I think it was in the Sand County Almanac, he was talking about, he does, you know, show a young baby a golf ball and they'll never get excited. But I'd like to see the first kid that doesn't start quivering when they see their first deer. You know, there's something there, and we can I think capitalize on that, but we have to start them young.
I think what we'll do is cut off the questions here. We appreciate all that, Jeff, just for time constraints. And if you want to give us a quick closing statement, we'd appreciate it.
I do. So first of all, let me say one thing about politics, because you know, I'm not going to go into my personal politics, but I am apolitical. Let me just say it that way. And I learned a long time ago that a picture might paint 1,000 words. So I've got a couple of pictures here for you. One's with me with one is with me with President Obama, and one's with me with President Trump. And yes, I am apolitical. That doesn't mean I don't know what it means to work for a politician, and I don't have any problem working for a politician, but you need to know that in both those pictures, President Obama in Washington, D.C., President Trump when I was down in Puerto Rico, my loyalty was not to the individual. My loyalty was to the Constitution of the United States of America. And so if you pick me for this position, my loyalty is going to be to the people and the wildlife of Arizona. And it's all about service. I really do believe in the importance of service. And for me, it's an awesome opportunity. Really excited about the potential for it because the love of my life, which is, aside from my wife, service of others and wildlife can actually come together in one position. So thank you very much for the opportunity to meet with you today. I know you got a hard job. I don't envy you that, but I look forward to hearing from you in the future.
Thank you very much. We appreciate you coming in.